Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Memory in a Time of Pandemic. In this series of videos, we talk with the world's leading memory experts about the ways in which the COVID pandemic is shaping our individual and collective remembering and forgetting. What will they personally remember from this time? What insights from their work and their fields will help us to understand memory, both during the pandemic and of the pandemic? Will COVID change the ways in which we study memory? This series is sponsored by Memory, Mind and Media, a new interdisciplinary journal launching this year from Cambridge University Press. I'm Amanda Barnier from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, founding co-editor of the journal alongside my colleague and friend Andrew Hoskins from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And in this episode, I'm in conversation with Professor Andrew Hoskins. Andrew is the Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow, and he's best known for his work on media, memory, forgetting and war. And of course, Andrew is the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Memory Studies, in which he has defined the field and set the agenda for interdisciplinary work for over a decade. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Amanda. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. So my first question for you is, when did these COVID times start for you? What's your sort of first memorable memory?
It seems to be being at home and just kind of tracking initially on the news, picking up some incidences from China and just, being third or fourth or fifth down the news agenda and thinking, oh, that's a bit weird, but not being worried about it, not being in any way concerned, just getting a sense of a brewing storm a long way away.
Yeah, exactly. And when do you have a sort of a firm memory of sort of when it tipped over the edge, became the top story, and sort of life started to change more in Glasgow?
Not really. I think what really defined it was a sense of our Prime Minister Boris Johnson making the official statement of lockdown. So obviously the news was trailed considerably before that. But it wasn't until, you actually got the news and then you kind of take a deep breath and think, well, what does this mean? What does this mean for us? And it was at that moment that you start reflecting on, possible consequences, possible changes in behavior and what it might mean for us.
Yeah, exactly. So are there any sort of, as you reflect back on that time, any images that stand out for you, whether things that you personally sort of saw or experienced or things you remember from the media?
Not particularly. It's odd, really. Obviously, there are some. The problem is when we talk about iconic images, they become iconic because we talk about them, and everyone's talked already about masks and hospitals in Britain. One of the defining images early on was certainly the vast warehouses and stadium that were converted into hospitals, kind of awaiting the huge mass numbers of expected casualties and. Which didn't, thankfully, at least in this country, materialize in that way. So there was a sense of that building expectation of the enormity of the event. These were huge places, and the scale was just incredible. So then you start to think about this as something that is not just affecting you personally and your individual and family life and work life being transformed, but a sense of something much greater that it becomes then hard to kind of measure or compare. These are really shocking images.
Yeah, and I guess what strikes me, because of course here in Australia we've been incredibly fortunate in our very low case levels. It's sort of that discrepancy between the images that we saw of what was going on in countries overseas, first in China, then in the US and in Italy and other places like that, most recently in India, and then sort of what was happening here. Still really unusual images. I think of, I've got very vivid memories or images of walking down the streets and the streets being empty, and Sydney's a really busy city, as you know, and no cars and no people out on the streets and our campus being deserted. And that for me seemed apocalyptic in some ways, even though we didn't have the same images.
Absolutely. Emptiness is definitely a signifier of apocalypse, isn't it? And we just got our sons in for a haircut just before lockdown, and there was this sense of foreboding, a sense of what was to come after the announcement. What did this mean for us? And just taking our sons into the hairdressers, there was a sense of, this was the end, and town, Glasgow City, where the hairdressers are, of course, is very populated, always busy, always crowded, always full of life. Just silence and emptiness and vast empty streets, be able to see down roads that would be normally full of crowds. It was incredible. And the hairdresser also, this sense of ending, a sense of an ending of normality came with the hairdresser who, our two very young sons always like going to the hairdressers because they get what they called hairdresser biscuits.
Right.
So the biscuits that the hairdressers give to you with a cup of coffee on the saucer. And the hairdresser said, oh, well, we won't need this anymore because they just go out of date by the time so they handed us this big bag of hairdresser biscuits, so which we're still getting through now. Even so, that was definitely a sign that that something normal was ending. So it was a definitive ending, and definitely apocalyptic in that sense of scale, that sense of emptiness, that sense of boding.
But interesting how sort of even quite trivial details can end up being some marker of something, can't they? And I remember being out and about during our lockdown. We were allowed to exercise for a set period of time each day, and going past playgrounds where there was police tape around it, and playgrounds were, when you have kids and you're always at playgrounds and you just think that I've never seen anything like that. Mundane sorts of things and experiences and places sort of somehow made quite different. You study in your research, Andrew, the memories of individuals, of communities, organizations and institutions in particular, that sort of comparison between sort of personal sort of narratives and institutional narratives. What stories do you think that those different groups are going to tell in the future about the pandemic?
It's a great question, because they are absolutely in competition with one another. There is, this is where we come to an important difference between remembering and forgetting. In some ways, there's this incredible imperative to remember and an impulse to remember, and that's not new to the pandemic. It's an age of the memory boom that we're living through now. This sense that we must or have to remember everything. I call it a radicalization of memory, where the past becomes something to battle over, something to fight over, something. And what's normal about traditional memorial patterns of big momentous events is that memory normally takes place like after World War I or World War II, 5 years or 10 years, or there's normally a gap, a space between. We've got to kind of assimilate the event, understand it, and then think about how we might come to remember it or memorialize it, or commemorate it in a whole variety of ways. But in the 21st century, memory is so much more part of the present than ever before. So this sense of, well, it's, how will we remember this event was the question that people were asking at the beginning of the event. And just think, what's going on here? So so I think that's one thing. So that's the imperative remember. We should remember is a real driving force. The second force is that we can remember. And this is what I call kind of participatory remembrance, or participatory past, the obsessive recording of the everyday, the excessive, obsessive documentation. And it's not a blanket criticism, it's partly compulsive. I think about all the photographs we endlessly take of our children all the time. Yeah. So this constant attention to recording the experience, as if we don't record the experience, it doesn't seem real.
Right. Yeah.
So with the pandemic, you have these two things coming together.
Yes.
Right? So we must remember it for all kinds of reasons we can talk about, about learning lessons so this doesn't happen again, about honoring and remembering and commemorating those that were lost and all, so very important reasons to remember and commemorate. That comes together with we're recording and commemorating, remembering everything all the time.
Right, exactly.
What interestingly for me brings those two things are defining is that it's not remembering at all. it is absolutely forgetting. It
Mm-hmm.
overload. Both of those forms of remembrance have in common overload,
Yeah.
distraction,
Yes.
accumulation. So the question then to ask is, what will be the consequence of all this memory and recording and documentation? You know, who will remember it? How will that memory be accessible, and by whom? You know, the thing about participatory, you talked about the relationship between the individual and the social.
Yeah.
I mean, that's completely transformed, and it's transformed through connectivity. So it's not just about me, you know. And interestingly enough, there was an example at the beginning of the pandemic. I saw on social media, someone opened a book and was opening a diary to record their memories of the pandemic. They recognise it as an important event to document their personal experiences. Okay, fine. And the chances are that record, that diary will be here in 50 years' time.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the rest of the world are sharing and sharing and sharing and uploading and messaging and spreading on social media, all of, you know, on top of that. So at an individual level, also there are hundreds and thousands of calls for memory stuff.
Right.
So you've got curators, you've got museums, you've got galleries, you've got institutions, you've got individuals, hundreds and thousands. Send us your memories, document experience. Okay, so out of all that stuff that's digitally recorded and documented and shared, my sense is that pretty much most of it will not be accessible in 50 years' time.
In 50 years. So it's really interesting, because, you know, is it the modern media and the modern media practices and the connectivity? I've been thinking a bit about, you know, the relationship between the pandemic and some experiences people have had. You know, in Australia, there's a lot of families who, you know, of an Indian background, who have families currently in India. They can't get back to them. There's really dire events happening, and this feeling that they're losing their family members far away and they can't get to them. And I reflect back on, you and I have talked before about a few years ago when I visited the Western Front, the battlefields of World War I, where, you know, Australian soldiers had fought and died, and at the end of a 5-year commemorative period and the centenary of, you know, the beginning and the end of World War I, and it struck me that in that commemoration it was quite deliberate in a sense, wasn't it, and quite thought through about the fact that people here in Australia couldn't go and visit, mostly for, you know, for generations, because they were just not able to. And so that way to commemorate people lost far away was, it really managed in a very particular way. And as you say, there's certain things were remembered and certain things are forgotten in the, you know, the memorials and the commemorations and the narratives that have been told and the way it's been thought about and talked about. But here is what you're saying, is that modern media is just making it spread everywhere, mushrooming out perhaps, or something.
Yeah. So there's the two, you know, so there's two parts of it. There's a triangle of forgetting, really. So one is that we should remember. The second is that we can remember the participatory past. And the third is the hidden infrastructures of remembering forgetting, the algorithms, the artificial intelligence, the data that is mined and shared and deleted and lost. And the question then becomes, well, who controls that? You know?
Right.
So, you know, think about the participatory past is very democratic and sounds very bottom up, and everyone says, oh, bottom up's a really good thing, let's all share our memories. But of that, who decides what will remain? Who controls that? Who owns those memories? Who owns that data? Who owns those images? Who owns those records? And, you know, it's perfectly laudable for many groups and individuals and museums and exhibitions and curators to try and gather and organize. But, you know, I'm very skeptical about what meaningful, accessible remembrance and memorialization, commemoration will be actually kind of available and accessible 20 or 30 years
in time.
from all.
Yeah. So you've talked about sort of the radicalization of memory. You've talked about participatory remembering, and how different institutions are calling for information as though that somehow that's the way forward in sort of getting a handle on what's going on and how we'll remember it. But how do you think COVID will change the way we study memory, or how should it change? I mean, it's obviously an event quite unlike many others. We often talk about sort of flashbulb events, or at least in psychological science, about things like 9/11 or the London bombings or whatever it might be. But of course, there have been very extended, difficult events of the kinds that you study, such as war. But I guess, where do you think the study of memory will go or be influenced by this pandemic period?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, it's tied up in these paradoxes or contradictions between those people who for very laudable good reasons want certain aspects to be remembered, and those who actually want to forget, because a lot of people just want to forget, they're suffering from mental illness, from struggles, from loneliness, from isolation, from the loss of loved ones. So I think it will force a greater competitiveness in these trends in remembering, forgetting. So in some ways, it kind of intensifies the radicalization of memory and the radicalization of forgetting. And then secondly, there's the political questions about those who are deemed to be responsible for organizing and coordinating responses like governments. And so in the United Kingdom, for instance, there's an almighty fight over when we should have an inquiry. So the government here have accepted we need a public inquiry in terms of response. Yeah. But they're saying, well, we're not going to start that till January. The sense is that, and the opposition parties argue that this inquiry will go on for years and years and years and years, like many public inquiries. So by the time their conclusions are reached, it's too late to one, hold anyone accountable, or two, to learn any lessons that are meaningful in terms of feeding into the next threat around a pandemic.
Yeah.
So a number of kind of competing memorial discourses, a number of competing memorial trajectories, and people who want to forget and versus others who want to remember. And obviously, other people want to remember those that they have lost. So there's a number of entanglements and competitions between different forms and types of remembering and forgetting that I think feels like ours need to kind of grapple with. And increasingly, as we've discussed many times, it's about how do you bring together the cognitive sciences and the social sciences and the humanities to some kind of common understanding or comprehension and inquiry into what memory is, what memory does, and why it's important, and how it works, and how it functions, and how it obviously dysfunctions, and the merits of forgetting versus the merits of remembering. And I think for me, I hope that one thing comes out of it, that people will see more that, remembering in itself is not necessarily, as David Reef and others argue, is not necessarily always a good thing. Some people want to forget, and especially with warfare, and other traumatic events, people want to forget. And people need to forget, and their potential to do that. I think there's always a clash between, an individual memory where people want to keep their grief, their trauma, their experiences that they want to forget, private and individual and separate. But yet they're confronted with all this,
exactly.
And with warfare especially, we've got the big commemorative and memorial moments and events that are constantly triggering off memories. And some people obviously want to engage in that, some people want to remember, but others want to and need to forget. So how do we accommodate those very different needs to remember and to forget?
Yeah, so the motivational elements of it. So what role do you think you're an expert in the sort of role of media in memory? And you sort of talked about, I think, given examples of formal media as well as informal media. I mean, here in Australia, it's been quite interesting to follow the media's sort of reckoning of the pandemic and the response to it here, and that somehow how out of step they've been. They've criticised some of our sort of state governments about their response, but the state government response is perfectly in step with the community's demands for certain kinds of, ways of tackling some of these challenges. And so then, the media has changed tact, and sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes shaping, sometimes not. And then, of course, the proliferation of, more informal kind of media. So what roles have you been noticing in terms of how media is shaping these discussions about remembering and forgetting?
Yeah, I mean, the news media, has shifted a number of times. And I think one of the difficult things for any kind of news media response, or trying to get a handle on what has happened over the past year or so, is the incredible uncertainty and unpredictability of the pandemic. So, sometimes there's a sense of it's all over, it's, we can get back to life as normal, we can act in a particular way. But I think one of the dominant discourses that the media have kind of pushed in our faces is the science versus politicians, science versus policy. And that seems to be one of the dominant conflicts of our age in determining responses and to understanding and grasping the magnitude of the threat and the risk versus our behavior. What should we do? And every other day you read something different.
Exactly.
Every day, and the scientists are also, it seems to me, not quite at war with each other, but there's a spectrum of scientific view. Okay, and depending on your political viewpoint or your policy viewpoint, your government viewpoint, you can bring a group of scientists and develop, a recommendation or an assessment of the situation that is fundamentally different from this group of scientists over here. So I think what we have got as a consequence is a much greater polarization within our. Obviously, that's a theme of the 21st century, greater polarization of media, separate media ecologies in which we inhabit and live our own realities. We've always only digested and gone to the media that kind of support our political and cultural standpoints, but there's something different going on. These are very different realities, and these very different realities, I think, are being much more easily forged in the way we can seek out and find like-minded bubbles of certain policy. And above all, the most worrying of this is conspiracy theories. That strikes me as the most concerning aspect of this separate realities, people living in a reality in which they absolutely believe that the vaccine, that one, the virus is a myth, and two, the vaccine is going to do you terrible harm, and it's really, really dangerous. So
and of course we saw that played out so strongly in the US presidential election, didn't we? That absolute polarization of different narratives and drawing on different evidence and sort of different arguments to be made that, for many would have seemed extremely credible on both sides, but an entirely different views of reality that I think continue to persist there and elsewhere. Absolutely.
And the difference with that today and 20 years ago is that we have the capacity to remain within the bubble of the reality through the mechanisms through which we consume that reality, namely social media. So it becomes much, much easier to go down a rabbit hole, to be within a particular echo chamber, to live and inhabit a reality whereby all the institutions in our lives all reflect the same reality.
Right.
So there's been some wonderful work by Arlie Russell Hochschild, who's a sociologist, and did some ethnography a few years ago now, before the Trump thing really got going. And she looked at some Southern Americans and found that, that their life world was very much dominated by certain institutions. Church, community, work, Fox News. So in the sense that these all work together to constitute a reality that it becomes then much more difficult to understand what on earth the reality is over there, because it is so different. And so this drives people deeper and deeper into these very separate rabbit holes or realities that increasingly diverge, and so there's no possibility of coming together. And I think in relation to serious risks from infection and hospitalization and death that vaccines ultimately will prevent for the most part. When a significant number of people believe that that is not true,
right.
or our post-truth or a post-trust society, then that's, I think, very worrying indeed.
Yeah, so we see so many behavioural examples, don't we, of the playing out of these sort of narratives, whether it's mask wearing or socially distancing or not gathering in groups or flying across countries or whatever it might be. And it's been so interesting to see. You've talked quite a lot there about sort of in a sense what different groups of, whether individuals and institutions will remember. What about the difference between what you think institutions will want us to remember versus what individual narrative, that sort of, the one versus the many? What will be the official stories, do you think, and how might they differ from our personal stories?
Yeah, I mean, partly that comes to the, in some senses, you think about government and politics of government, there are, certain laws in many countries about what information is allowed to be released, and sometimes that's not till, in this country at least, between 20 and 30 years after the event, and only then not all information will be released in terms of what decisions were made, by whom, and on what grounds. So there's always a lag in some kinds of institutional memories. Others are much more exposed to the rages of social media. So whereas 20 or 30, 40 years ago, I think many institutions, in terms of how they dealt with events and how they collected or used memories of events, were very much inward looking. Now they're much more exposed to, what I've said is this kind of participatory culture, participatory past. And that's not necessarily a good thing. It is in some ways, in the sense that, there's a greater involvement in our memorial institutions. But again, my question is, what will remain of that? What will actually survive in 10 or 20 or 30 years time? And who is the dominant player? Who ultimately will, out these institutions and individuals and governments, organize and coordinate any sense of, if we can talk in terms of a national commemoration or a national memorial. There's lots of talk about that, but what will be its function, and who decides? And these things, as we've seen over the past 20, 30 years, are increasingly toxic.
Right.
Look at the memory of 9/11, in terms of the debates over what should be a commemoration of that, and who should be involved, and where should it be, and what should it look like. It seems that, we're doing that with all aspects and elements of our past now. So COVID is caught up in this radicalization of memory, and that's not necessarily a good thing, because I think it will lead to a much more contested set of versions of events, but also a great deal of forgetting through the various overloads of memory, ironically. So how we come then to learn lessons, how we make sense in some kind of collective or social or national fashion, I think it's going to be hugely, hugely difficult. And yet, if we don't quickly learn the lessons, then our preparedness and our resilience for future pandemics and other catastrophes and disasters are going to be much, much weakened.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you said there that you asked the question, well, what will remain in 20 years or 50 years? So let's come back to the personal and back to you with my last question and say, well, what will remain for you? What's made the deepest impression on you so far about the pandemic? And what do you think that you'll remember most from this time in 20 years or 50 years or however long it might be?
Great deal of stress and anxiety, I think. Being stuck at home with 3 children, how much I love them and my partner, and not being able to work and stress and anxiety about that, stress and concern about my job. And like many people, this is not unique to me. This is a common experience. I guess, a sense of relief and being lucky that I still have a job, you know, because in the early days, and you know, so many people have lost their livelihoods and their jobs. So I guess it would be, one, a sense of a very difficult year, and two, a sense of relief that we got through it, I think, which seems to
it makes me think of Norman Brown's you know, really fascinating work about living in history, that idea of being right deep in history in our personal lives, and also makes me think of Robin Fivebush's work about redemptive narratives. I guess that hopefully for all of us there'll be redemption somewhere at the end of this really difficult,
the ways we often line our personal lives up and say, you know, in relation to a pandemic or war or 9/11, you know, we say, well, we were there, you know, and that obviously gives us a certain authority and a certain capacity and ability to talk about and to re-narrate those events. And I'm just worried about the trajectory of that narration. Who will control it? What will it mean? And what will be available of that, you know, in the future? And coming back to my example from earlier on, you know, that person I said who had that diary, who started recording her experiences from the beginning of the pandemic, that diary is much more likely to be here in 50 years than all of the other mediated aspects of remembrance, an overload of that we've been talking about.
So there'll be plenty of fodder for us in memory-minded media, won't there, for all of us to talk about and to think through and to work hard on, I think, in the future. So thanks for answering all of my questions and for talking today, and we'll see you and everyone online again soon.
Thanks so much, Amanda. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.